Ad Infernum is a challenging game for me to review, one where I genuinely have a hard time finding what its main focus was. I've been following the developer, Glass Knuckle, for a while now, and I was overjoyed to learn of its release for PC on Leap Day, February 29th, 2024. And that's for a base price of $9.99 for, in my experience, about 2 hours of playtime for one playthrough, with much more of an emphasis on cranking up the difficulty and adding modifiers on a second run-through. Now, as for why I find this game as a challenging mix to review, it's actually quite simple. Ad Infernum heavily features immersive sim and survival horror elements that blend together sometimes really well, and other times they tug and pull the gameplay focus and mix like oil and water. The gameplay loop of Ad Infernum reads as this. You'll solve both intellectual and environmental puzzles in order to complete each phase of the story, and while it's a relatively small and compact play space, namely a culty gas station and a few other spots around, there's a lot to unravel as you dig deeper. All the while, you'll be trying to stealth around enemies to accomplish your goals. When stealth fails, your fight or flight will kick in, and you'll have to start all over again. That said, let's break it down step by step, and I think we can cover the visuals and the sound design here too. Okay, so let's start with the setting, the gas station. Immediately, the colors pop. The neon sign and other lights differentiate from the very dark and moody atmosphere, and pretty much all of the other models around the environments differentiate very well. What I really like in games like this are the differences of materials and how they are displayed. From metal bars, reflective glass, warped wood, or even fabrics on car covers, it all shows really well here. Each of these have debris and particles when hit that bounce off, as well as different sound effects, which really adds to the immersion in this regard. To me, these aspects add a lot to the atmosphere. But where it gets really interesting are the items around the world, like cans or bricks. These are quite interactive, much like the physics system of Amnesia or Penumbra, with a variety of uses ranging from breaking glass to some rudimentary distractions and even damaging enemies. While the option is nice to have, these rarely fed into the exploration or traversal how I'd hoped the game would have encouraged. Much like the stereotypical immersive sim, stacking boxes to get to certain locations, it's not really necessary here. It was truly just easier in basically every scenario to not do those sorts of things, and in favor of the game being a little more fast-paced in the sense of horror, with a chase sequence or even combat, it really felt like it would have just been tedious trying to do these things in this world. Moving on to the traversal and the stealth, I actually really loved this aspect mostly. Especially later, there is a genuine emphasis on platforming, and it works great in the confines of the game's world. The stealth mechanics are simple, but have just enough factors to feel satisfying. Being in or out of the light, the line of sight, or your movement speed all play a factor here. The player agency I love comes from having to, say, turn off lights or even shoot out lights to sneak around more effectively. One thing I will say is, while committing to stealth, you'll notice that the enemy detection is very forgiving. I'm not sure if this changes based on one of the game's many difficulties, but it's pretty simple in that regard, and I would have loved to see that ramped up even higher, which would in turn require me to make more distractions, plan my routes more carefully rather than just hiding behind the nearest car at all times. However, despite your best efforts, you can't always stay undetected. You may get caught walking out of the store with your pants down. In these moments, you'll have two choices, to run or to fight. Running can be tense if you get stuck on some part of the environment, which is frustrating in the moment. That can basically result in either struggle or fight. Running can be tense, especially if you get stuck on the environment or a downed enemy that you've fought earlier. That can get pretty frustrating, I can't lie, but otherwise, since you are faster than the enemies, it doesn't feel too tense getting back to the safe room, as long as you know the route. I wish there was some way to kind of boost the enemy pathing in order to kind of keep up with the player or force you as the player to block their path, but otherwise there's no reason to want to slow enemies down, or you could simply climb out of their reach. Though sometimes you may be equipped to fight back instead. Having a healthy stockpile of nails for your nail gun, a sturdy melee weapon, or even one of the heavier firepowers within the game, you may feel just a bit more bold. The melee weapons don't feel particularly strong with any great feedback, but the guns do especially have a nice pop with both the sound effects and the visual feedback of the enemies taking the hit, especially as you upgrade each of these guns to pack a little bit more of a punch. It's the combat of the game which I truly do enjoy. It's very much function over form in a lot of ways, and I think that's perfectly fine. That is also clear for the majority of the game. It is not exactly adhering to any one visual style. But as I round out talking about the gameplay for a second, there's one thing that I wanted to make exclusively very clear. This game does try to be a horror game at times, and I think after that initial warm-up of learning this very small and tight location, that fear goes away very quickly, leaving the immersive sim sandbox, which I hope I've expressed by this point, isn't as fully blown as I may have liked. Ultimately, all roads lead to either fighting enemies or avoiding them to the point where you have to fight them in the later aspects of the game. And this de-evolution down into a combat game is where the game succeeds in the sense that I think it feels satisfying enough. However, it's the loss of both the horror and immersive sim elements in that last aspect of the game, which really does throw me for a loop as to what the theme was. There is a safe room in the game, which I've already alluded to as a place to run to. It features a storage box, which allows you to store items in between your runs outside, as well as a way to break down the items you find and craft new ones from blueprints that you found. And from a way to crunch numbers and, collect these different resources to make the playthrough how you see fit, I think this works really well. But once again, with this very Resident Evil style safe room, I can't lie that as the game becomes more and more familiar to you as the player, that's when it begins to lose that atmosphere that I so strive for this game to have. But to wrap up, I actually want to briefly talk about the story, and this is one of the parts that I at first was very iffy on, but upon thinking about it, I really, really did enjoy it. And that's for a couple of different reasons. One thing off the bat that I will say was really funny and kind of weird, but one of my biggest issues with the story is that whoever was writing the script didn't realize that there's a space bar. And so the opening cinematic of the game where your friend is talking in the car, there's just no gaps whatsoever.
It's worth putting up with him for the week. We can figure out the sleeping arrangements once we get there. Arm wrestle to see who gets the air mattress. You know Audrey, that girl from foreign policy class? She's actually going to be there too. I kind of told her where we were going during class. It's a little embarrassing, but she made this mixtape for the drive. I've been talking to her about the local music scene. Her taste is a little odd, but she's actually recommended a few killer bands. Like, did you know some of the...
So that's funny. I mean, that's not really an actual criticism. It was just weird. But you know what? The game is trying to be a little weird, so it was just off-putting in the right way. But with that being said, you're basically in a car accident and left stranded at a cult-owned gas station, or cult-controlled previously gas station, in the middle of a storm, so you don't want to stray out too far and you can't get help until you pick up a walkie-talkie and you've got another survivor on the other end of the line. And through this, she will be giving you little story points and basically new objectives throughout. Otherwise, you will find notes around the world, some of them very important and others not so much. Some of them were just like, okay, they're there to read, but it's not that important. A few of them clue you into some puzzles around the world, but otherwise it's not that crazy. But what I think this game does a really good job with, narratively speaking, is leading you on to a certain degree, and if you really think about the themes, that I've laid out with a cult and all of that sort of thing, it makes perfect sense the turns that it does take. And especially when you get into those final aspects of the narrative, there is like a decision at the end. I think it's laid the groundwork for it beautifully. And in that regard, I think this game handles its themes really, really well, at least the way that I'm taking it away. I'll leave those up to you to fully explore. But I really enjoyed that aspect. And another thing I want to say, outside of that character speaking in the beginning, the only other voice you hear is the girl through the walkie-talkie. And her voice acting was really good. I thought it was a great compliment to the story, as well as all of the other creature sound effects throughout the game. Another thing I think the game does really well is the environment does change as you reach different levels of the plot point. Not just going to, those couple different areas that I mentioned earlier, but the actual environment around the gas station does change and evolve as you've completed more and more of your tasks, which once again feeds into the narrative in a really interesting way if you're paying attention. So with all of that being said, I want to say that for $10 and a good bit of replayability, this is I don't want to say a baby's first horror immersive sim, but it's one of the few in a genre that's like a genre mashup that tackles it in such a hands-off kind of way. In that way, I really like the game, and I do recommend it for anyone who wants to mess around with those immersive sim aspects. They are there. However, if you're just looking for a horror game, listen, man, there's a launch discount right now, maybe a couple dollars less than that. Otherwise, this is a game that I walk away enjoying a lot of the aspects of it. However, it's not something that I feel like I'm ever going to play again after I did my first and second runs. But anyways, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching this video, and yeah, my name is Falling Hurts. Subscribe. Goodbye.